On the last Saturday in April, in the spring of 1911, a widow of 67 years stood on the loading platform at the Harrow Bend Depot and counted 40 oak barrels while half the men in Ledbetter County watched her do it. The barrels had come back from the cooper that morning with fresh iron hoops on them, bright as new coins in the sun. And she went down the row touching each one on the head as she counted, the way a person counts something that belongs to her and to nobody else. She wore a brown calico work dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and a stained canvas apron over it, and a faded cream sunbonnet pushed back off her gray hair. And she was not a tall woman, nor a graceful one. She was thick through the shoulders from 40 years of hauling, and her hands were the hands of a person who has never once in her life paid somebody else to lift a thing she could lift herself. The pump agent was standing by the freight door with a leather sample case at his feet, and he had an audience, and he could not let it pass. He was a lean, clean-shaven man in a Greytown suit and a black bowler hat, the kind of man who arrives in a valley with a catalog and leaves with everybody's money and everybody's good opinion at the same time. He looked at the barrels, and he looked at her, and then he said it loud enough that it carried the whole length of the platform, over the freight scales, and out into the road. "There goes the last woman in the county," he said, "paying good money to move water that comes free out of a pipe." The men laughed, not cruelly, most of them. It was the easy laugh a crowd gives a joke it has already heard, because by that April the joke was 9 years old and had worn smooth as a doorsill. Somebody called out to ask whether she meant to float them or drink them. Somebody else said the widow's barrels were the only navy Ledbetter County would ever have. She let them finish. Then she paid the drayman and had the barrels loaded on her wagon, 4 across and stacked, and she climbed up on the seat and clucked to her mules and drove out of Harrow Bend at a walk, past the mercantile and the bank and the livery, with the whole town watching 40 oak barrels go by. Her name was Orpha Hallett, and she farmed 80 acres 4 miles north of town on a low rise where the prairie began to break toward the hills. She had been born in a sod house and had never been on a train in her life. She had buried her husband in the spring of 1892, and in the 19 years since, she had run the place alone, hiring help at planting and at harvest, and doing the rest of it herself. She was an old woman with a straight back and a plain way of talking, and if you had asked anybody in the valley to describe her, they would have got to the water inside of 2 sentences. Because that was the thing about her. Everybody knew it. The widow Hallett and her water. What they meant was the well. It stood 40 steps from her kitchen door inside a low fieldstone well house with a shingled roof, and it was a hand-dug well, stone-cribbed all the way down, 42 feet from the curb to the water. Her husband and 2 hired men had dug it in the summer of 1879, working with pick and bucket and windlass, sending the spoil up in a leather-bottomed tub, taking 11 weeks and most of a season's cash money to do it. They had gone down through 9 feet of black soil, and then through clay, and then through a long, mean stretch of sand and gravel that ran and slumped and had to be cribbed as fast as they cut it. At 38 feet, they had struck a blue rock seam, and the water that came up out of that seam was so cold it made your teeth ache in August, and it came in faster than they could dip it, and her husband had climbed out of that hole, grinning like a boy, and told her they would never want for water as long as they lived. He had been right, though he had not lived long enough to see how right. He caught a chill hauling hay in a wet October, and it went to his lungs, and he was dead in 11 days, and she was 48 years old, with a mortgage and a place to run. The neighbors came, the way neighbors do, and then the neighbors went home, the way neighbors do, and she was left with 80 acres, and a barn, and a team, and a hole in the ground, with cold water at the bottom of it. And every spring after that, without missing a single year, she paid 2 men to clean it. That was the part the valley could not forgive her. Cleaning a dug well is filthy, slow, unglamorous work, and it costs money, and it produces nothing you can sell. The men would come the first week of April and rig the windlass, and one of them would go down on a rope with a lantern hung at his belt, while the other stayed at the curb and hauled. They dipped it dry, bucket by bucket, and then the man below scrubbed the stone crib with a stiff brush and lime water and reset any rock that had worked loose over the winter and picked the fallen gravel out of the bottom and cut another few inches of the blue rock away so the seam stayed open. It took 4 days. She paid them $3 a day apiece, and she fed them dinner. And when they came up, she gave them each a clean towel and a bar of soap and the use of the pump trough, and she never once haggled the price down. Then there were the barrels. She kept 40 of them, white oak, tight cooperage, and every spring she hauled them to town to a cooper who set new hoops and swelled the staves and charged her 50 cents a barrel to do it. She kept a water wagon under the shed with a flat bed and chocks for 10 barrels, and she kept the running gear greased and the tires tight, and she kept a team of heavy mules named Judge and Nettie that ate all winter and earned nothing at all from November to April. And she kept a hardwood shoulder yoke hanging on a peg by the well house door with 2 big oak buckets on it, because there were places on the place a wagon could not go. It cost her $44 a year, and she knew that figure the way some people know a hymn. $24 for the men, $20 for the cooper, and that was before you counted the mule's feed and the grease and her own time. Over 19 years it came to better than $800, and $800 in Ledbetter County in 1911 was a milk herd, or a threshing share, or a good many years of not lying awake. She could have sold the barrels. She could have sold the wagon and the mules and put the money in the bank at 4% and let the well fill up with gravel like everybody else's. Year after year she went on doing it instead, and year after year the valley shook their heads over her and told the story again at the mercantile, and she never explained herself to a living soul. The trouble had started in 1903 when the Drive Point pumps came to the valley. They were a marvel, and there is no use pretending otherwise. A driven point is a length of iron pipe with a hardened perforated tip, and you drive it into the ground with a maul or a weight on a tripod, section by section, until it goes below the water, and then you screw a pitcher pump on top, and you have a well. 2 men could put one down in a day and a half. It cost $31 complete, pump and pipe and point, and a length of lead pipe to run it into the kitchen, and a woman who had spent her whole life carrying buckets from a curb in the yard could stand at her own sink in her own house and bring up water with 6 strokes of a handle. No rope, no windlass, no lid to lift in the dark, no child ever falling in. The agent for the Meridian Company worked the valley for 2 seasons, and he was very good at his work. He drove out to a farm with a wagon and a tripod and put a point down in the yard as a demonstration, and by the time the water came up the farmer's wife had already decided, and the farmer signed. 84 farms in Ledbetter County had drive points by 1911, and the ones that did not were mostly the ones down on the bottoms where the creek served. And the old dug wells, the deep ones, the stone-cribbed ones that had taken a season and a fortune to sink, went out of use in a single decade. Some were capped. A good many were filled in with stone and stump wood and the barn cleanings of a winter, because an open well in a yard is a danger, and because a field well is 1 more square rod of ground you can plow. Orpha Hallett did not have a drive point put down. The agent came out twice. The second time he brought a sample point to show her, and she looked at it politely and gave him coffee and told him no, and when he asked her why, she told him the truth, which was a mistake because it made a story out of her. She told him her husband had gone through 29 feet of running sand to get below it, and that everything above the blue rock was topwater, and topwater is only the rain that fell last year, and one day it would not be there. She told him a driven point at 22 feet was drinking out of the sand, and the sand was a sponge, and a sponge holds exactly as much as you put in it. She said her well drank out of the rock, and the rock was fed from the hills, and the hills did not care what kind of a summer you were having. The agent wrote that down in his book and told it in town, and by the following winter it had become a comic recitation. Men would do her voice at the feed store, hunching their shoulders and saying the rock does not care what kind of a summer you are having, and everybody would laugh. The school children had a rhyme about the water woman that they sang skipping rope in the yard, and it was not a mean rhyme, but she heard it once when she came in with eggs, and she stood a moment before she went on. There was a man named Dorsey Kell who farmed the quarter section adjoining hers on the east, a big red-faced man with a good heart and a loud mouth, and he had said to her face across a fence line, in front of his own hired man, that if she wanted a hole in the ground that badly, he would dig her one for nothing and she could keep the dirt. She had told him she would bear it in mind. So that was where things stood on the last Saturday in April in 1911, with 40 oak barrels on a wagon and the whole town watching them go by. It did not rain in May. That in itself meant nothing, because May can be dry and June makes it up. The wheat came on thin, but it came on. It did not rain in June either. And by the middle of the month, people had begun to say the word out loud in the way people do, half joking, touching wood. The corn rolled its leaves at noon and opened them at night. The pastures went from green to a pale straw color and then to something with no color in it at all. By the last week of June, the Little Sable Creek had quit running. It stood in pools under the cut banks, warm and green and thick, with the minnows dying in them, and then the pools shrank in on themselves and cracked at the edges, and the willows along it turned brown from the tops down. The dust in the section road was over your shoe tops, and it came up behind a wagon in a column you could see 3 miles off. The sun rose the color of an old penny through the haze and went down the same way. That was the drought of 1911, and old men in that country were still measuring summers against it 30 years later. The pumps began to fail in the first week of July, and they failed the way the widow Hallett had said they would, which is what made it unbearable. A drive point at 22 feet is a straw stuck into wet sand. When the water table dropped, the sand above the pipe went dry first, and the water that was left drew down toward the tip, and the pumps started giving that hollow, gasping stroke that every farmer in the county learned to recognize inside of 1 week. You would get half a bucket at daybreak when the sand had recovered overnight, and then nothing until evening. Men pulled their points and drove them deeper and found only more sand. Some of them drove clean down onto the blue rock, and the point would not go through it, and the tip would turn over or the pipe would buckle. And there they would stand in the yard at dusk with $60 of iron ruined and their wives inside with no water to wash a dish. The whole county went looking for water at once, and there was not much of it left to find. The town cistern at Harrow Bend held out until the middle of July on rain that had fallen the year before. 2 farms on the bottoms had springs that ran until August. 3 or 4 old dug wells had never been filled in, and their owners cleaned them out in a hurry and got muddy. Sulphurous water at 12 and 15 feet that made people sick. And 40 steps from Orpha Hallett's kitchen door, 42 feet down, behind a stone crib scrubbed clean the first week of April. As it had been scrubbed clean every April for 19 years, the blue rock seam went on making water at the rate it had made water since 1879, cold enough to ache your teeth. Faster than a windlass could bring it up. Dorsey Kell came to her gate at first light on the 8th of July with 2 milk cans in the back of a spring wagon and his hat in his hands. He did not make a speech about it. He was not that kind of man, and anyway there was nothing to say that both of them did not already know. He stood in her yard with the sun not up yet, and told her his point had been gasping 4 days, and his wife had been carrying wash water up from a hole in the creek bed, and his milk cows had not had a proper drink since Sunday. Then he asked her, and he had to work at it, whether she would sell him some water. She did not say a word about the fence line or the hole in the ground or the dirt he had offered to let her keep. She told him to bring the cans, and she walked him out to the well house and lifted the lid and set the windlass turning, and the 2 of them filled both his cans and a barrel besides, and when he reached in his pocket, she told him to put it away. "Not this morning," she said. "You will pay when you can haul." He drove out of her yard with the sun just coming over the rise and the water slopping cold against the tin, and by 10 o'clock that morning there were 4 more wagons in her lane. She set her price that same afternoon, and she said it once, and she never moved it. 25 cents a barrel, delivered to your yard. 10 cents if you hauled it yourself and drew it yourself and put the lid back on the way you found it. Stock water free at the curb trough for any family with a child under school age. And she did not advertise that part. And she did not put it in the book, and the men who found it out from their wives. It was the women who came first, most of them in the early part of it, because it was the women who knew to the cupful what was left in the house. A woman from the Nagel place came up the lane on foot on the 10th of July with a baby on her hip and 2 empty lard cans, having walked a mile and a half in the heat because her husband had the team out looking for pasture, and she stood in the yard and could not get the sentence started. Orpha Hallett took the baby off her, handed her a dipper, sat her down on the well house step in the shade of the roof, and filled both cans and a stone jug besides, and put them in a barrow, and pushed the barrow the mile and a half herself with the woman walking beside her, carrying the child. She did not put that in the book either. She came back at dusk with the empty barrow and made her own supper, and was at the crank again at 4 the next morning. By the end of the first week, she could not keep up. 1 wagon, 10 barrels to the load, 4 miles out and 4 miles back over roads that shook a full barrel to slop, and a windlass that one woman of 67 can only turn so many times in a day. She was out at the well at 4 in the morning, with a lantern hung on the crib, filling barrels standing in the yard so the wagon could go the minute the mules were harnessed, and she was still out there past dark. On the 11th of July, she stood in the lane and looked at 9 wagons waiting and did the arithmetic, and knew she could not do it alone. So she hired it done. She sent word to town that she wanted 2 wagons with teams and drivers, and she offered $2 a day and dinner, which was a good wage that summer with the wheat burnt up and no harvest work anywhere in the county. She hired Dorsey Kell, who had offered to dig her a hole for nothing. She hired the drayman from the depot who had loaded her 40 barrels in April and heard the joke and laughed at it with everybody else. Before August was out, she had a 3rd rig running, and one of the men who had done her voice at the feed store was driving it, and if she ever once mentioned any of that to any of them, no one ever heard about it. That was how the thing ran for 80 days. 3 wagons, 10 barrels to the load, 3 loads a day apiece when the roads allowed, and 10 barrels always standing full at the well house so no rig ever waited on the windlass. 40 barrels. That was what the 40 barrels were for, and every man who had laughed on the depot platform in April worked it out for himself sometime in July and had the grace not to say so. The routine had a shape to it inside of a week. The first wagon pulled out at 4:30 with a lantern on the bow. The men learned to swing the empties down and the fulls up without setting them on the ground, because a full barrel weighs better than 260 pounds, and a man who drops one does not drop a second. She stood at the curb most of the day herself, with the crank in both hands and her sleeves rolled and her bonnet on the back of her neck. And the cold came up out of that hole all day long, and men said afterward that stepping into her well house in August was like walking into October. The schoolhouse at Sable Corner opened in September with no water at all, and the teacher came out to see her about it, and after that a barrel went to the schoolhouse entry every second day, covered, with a tin dipper on a chain, and it was never once on anybody's bill. The town cistern at Harrow Bend gave out on the 19th of July, and after that, the mercantile and the hotel and the barber and the 2 churches all took delivery from a wagon with a widow's name chalked on the tailboard. And the storekeeper kept the tally in his own ledger because it was easier than settling every load. A man came out from the county seat in the last week of July, a stout man in a linen suit with a gold watch chain who had a notion about water and about what a person could get for it in a year like that one. He stood in her yard and offered her $1 a barrel for everything her well would make, all of it, and he would haul it himself and sell it where he liked, 4 times her price, and cash on the day. She turned him down flat, and she did it in front of 2 of her own drivers and Dorsey Kell, and what she said got repeated in that valley for 30 years. She said the water had not got any better since June. She said a barrel of it was worth 25 cents in a wet year, and it was worth 25 cents now. And if she took $1 for it today, then what she had been selling all along was not water, it was other people's bad luck, and she would not have that on her book. Then she told him he was welcome to stop for dinner. And he did not stop for dinner. The barn fire at the Ketchum place came on the 14th of August in the afternoon in a hot south wind, and it is the reason that some people in that county could not talk about the widow Hallett afterward without stopping in the middle of a sentence. Nobody ever knew how it started. The Ketchums were 3/4 of a mile from her lane, and her middle wagon was on the road between the two places with 10 full barrels on it when the smoke went up. The driver put the mules into a run and was in the yard inside of 4 minutes with 260 gallons of cold water while the fire was still working in the hay at the north end. The neighbors got there behind him with wet sacks and got a line going from the wagon, and they saved the granary and the 2 draft horses and the west half of the barn. And the Ketchums did not lose the winter's oats. There was no other water within 1.5 miles that day. Not a drop in the creek, not a stroke in their pump, nothing in the county but what was already loaded on a wagon on the road because an old woman had spent 19 years keeping barrels ready for no reason anybody could name. After the 14th of August, the joke was over in Ledbetter County. It did not end with an apology, because that is not how a valley works. It ended the way weather ends. Men who had laughed on the depot platform in April took their hats off in her lane in August without thinking about it. The rhyme stopped in the schoolyard. At the feed store, if a newcomer started in on the water woman, somebody would tell him to leave it alone and would not explain why, and the newcomer would work it out soon enough. The railroad came to her in the last week of July, and that was the piece nobody had foreseen. The line through Harrow Bend was a branch, 2 trains a day each way, and a locomotive drinks. The depot tank was fed by a windmill over a shallow bored well behind the stock pens, and that well went the way every shallow well in the county went. Without water at Harrow Bend, the trains had to make the run from the division point and back on one filling, and by the middle of July the section foreman was watching his tank drop a foot a day and writing letters that nobody answered. He drove out to her place on a Tuesday evening, a squat gray-headed man in a railroad vest, and he walked around that well house and looked down the hole with a lantern and asked her a great many questions about the seam and the recovery rate and how far she had drawn it down in 3 weeks of hauling. She told him she had not drawn it down at all, not measurably, that she dipped it every April and knew what it made, and it was making the same today as it had made in 1879. He asked whether she would contract to keep the depot tank supplied. She said she would if it did not cost the families in the valley their water, and he said the company would pay $15 a day for what she could deliver at night. And she thought about it for the length of time it takes to fill a pipe and told him yes. So a 4th rig went on, a hired one, running at night. It went out of her lane at 9 and came back at midnight and went again, and for 40 days there was a lantern moving on the Harrow Bend Road at hours when that country had never had anything on it but coyotes. The depot tank stayed up. The branch ran on schedule the whole of that drought, and there were 3 counties north of there where it did not. The night hauling is the part the drivers talked about afterward. The dust laid down a little after dark, and the air off the burnt pasture went from unbearable to merely hot. And a man on a loaded wagon with a lantern swinging on the bow could hear the water shifting in the barrels behind him for 4 miles, with nothing else moving anywhere in that country. They passed farmhouses with a light still burning in a kitchen at 11 at night, and they knew what that meant, because a woman does not sit up at 11 o'clock in a dry August for the pleasure of it. Twice on that road a man came out of a dark yard and stood in the wheel track with his hands up, and both times the driver stopped and gave him a barrel off the load and took nothing for it and made the difference up at the depot out of his own pocket. And when the widow Hallett found that out in September, she paid both men back double and told them they should have stopped for 3. August was the hard month. The thermometer on her well house, shaded side, hit 106 on the 2nd, and 108 on the 9th. The mules got harness sores, and she doctored them herself with a mixture her mother had taught her and rested them by turns, and would not let a driver take a team out twice in a day, whatever the wagons behind them were waiting for. She lost 11 pounds that summer. She had a spell of dizziness at the curb on the 22nd of August and sat down on the well house step and would not let anybody send for a doctor, and drank a dipper of her own water and got up and went back to the crank. The stock water was the thing that ate at her. Cattle drink. A milk cow in that heat will take 20 gallons in a day, and a man with 30 head cannot haul that in barrels, and there were herds in Ledbetter County that summer that were sold off in July for whatever a buyer would say, because there was no water for them and no grass either. She opened her curb trough to any man who would drive his stock in and work the windlass himself, all day and half the night, and there were nights when there were 3 herds bedded in her lane waiting a turn, and her yard was beaten to powder, and her fences went down in 2 places, and she never charged a cent for a head of it. That was not business. She knew it was not business. She said once that a well is not a thing you own. It is a thing you keep, and there is a difference. And she did not explain that either. The pump agent came back on the 9th of September. He had had a hard summer. 84 points in that county, and most of them gasping, and men who had signed his notes standing in their yards looking at him with their hats in their hands and no water in the house. He came out to her place in a hired buggy with his sample case, and he did not have a catalog in his hand this time. He stood at her curb in the late sun with the cold coming up out of it, and he looked down that hole for a long while without saying anything at all. Then he asked her, straight out and quiet, what it would take to put down a well like hers. She told him. 11 weeks. 3 men. Stone for the crib and lumber for the curb and a good windlass and a season's cash money, and after that 4 days and $24 every April for as long as you owned the place, forever, whether you needed it or not, in wet years and in dry. And most of those years you will be laughed at for it, and in 1 year out of 20 it will be the only water in the county. He said he did not think he could sell that. She said no, she did not imagine he could, and that was the whole of the conversation. He got in his buggy and drove back to Harrow Bend, and he was gone out of that country before Christmas, and no one there ever heard of him again. It rained on the 28th of September. It came in the afternoon out of the northwest with a cold front behind it, and it rained 1.5 inches in 3 hours and another inch in the night, and men stood out in their yards in it and got wet on purpose. It rained again the 2nd week of October, and again the week after that, and the creek ran a little by November, and the pumps came back one by one through the winter as the sand took up water again. Her last delivered load went out on the 26th of September, 2 days before the rain, and she kept the barrels full for another week anyway, because she did not trust one rain, and she was right not to. She kept her book in pencil in a ledger with a marbled cover, 1 line to a load, ruled in her own hand, and when she added it up in October, it came to 7,268 barrels delivered between the 8th of July and the 26th of September at 25 cents the barrel. That was $1,817. The railroad had run 40 nights at $15 a night, which was $600. $2,417 from a hole in the ground that had cost her $44 a year for 19 years to keep clean, and from 40 oak barrels that a man in a bowler hat had called a navy on a Saturday morning in April. The settling happened on the depot platform at Harrow Bend on a Thursday in the middle of October, and it happened in public because that is where the railroad paid its accounts, and because the storekeeper had her town tally in his ledger and brought it down to save her a trip. The section foreman counted out $600 into her hand on the freight scales in front of 9 or 10 men, in bills and had her sign for it. Then the storekeeper opened his book on the same scales and read out what the mercantile and the hotel and the 2 churches and the barber and the livery owed her for the summer, and then he added the 2 together out loud, because he was a careful man, and he read his figures aloud as a habit, and the number went down that platform in the still October air with everybody standing there hearing it. $2,417. Nobody laughed. There was a long moment on that platform when 9 or 10 grown men found things to look at, and the widow Hallett folded the bills and put them in a flat leather purse inside her apron and thanked the foreman by name and asked after his wife. Then she went and got her wagon. Dorsey Kell told the rest of it for years afterward, and he always told it the same way. He said the thing that finished him was not the money. He said the thing that finished him was that she had the empty barrels loaded 4 across and stacked, exactly the way she had hauled them out of that same yard in April with the whole town watching. And she drove out past the mercantile at a walk in exactly the same manner, and there was not one thing different about it. She had not learned anything in August that she did not already know in April. It was the town that had learned. She paid her drivers $2 a day, every day, and never docked a man an hour, and she paid them a week extra at the end because they had earned it in heat that had put 2 of them down sick. She bought a new manila rope and a new set of buckets. She paid the cooper to go over all 40 barrels. She put a covered barrel with a chained dipper in the entry of the Sable Corner schoolhouse and paid a boy 50 cents a week to keep it filled, and that barrel was still there when the school closed 22 years later. She put the rest in the bank, and it stayed there, and she farmed her 80 acres and never bought another acre and never built onto the house. And the following April, on the first Monday of the month, 2 men came out and rigged the windlass, and one of them went down on a rope with a lantern at his belt and dipped that well dry and scrubbed the stone crib with lime water and reset 2 rocks and took another 2 inches off the bottom of the blue rock seam, and it took 4 days and cost her $24. Exactly as it had cost her $24 every April for 19 years, and would cost her every April for 11 more. She stood at the curb and hauled for them, and paid them in the yard, and gave them a towel and a bar of soap and the use of the trough. The difference was that nobody in Ledbetter County thought it was funny. 11 men asked her that autumn what it would take to have a well dug the old way, and she told every one of them the truth, which was the 11 weeks and the 3 men and the stone and the money and the 4 days every April forever. 3 of them did it. The other 8 put their points back down when the water came back, and who is to blame them? Because the water did come back. And a pitcher pump at the kitchen sink is a wonderful thing, and it was another 19 years before that country had a summer like 1911 again. But there is a thing worth saying about the 8, and about the whole valley, and about anybody who has ever stood at a fence line and watched an old woman spend money on something that pays nothing. The drive point was not a fraud. It was cheap because it was shallow, and it was shallow because shallow is what most years require. That is the honest bargain, and most years it is a good one. The only trouble with it is that it is a bargain made against the average, and the average is not what comes to your yard in August. What comes to your yard in August is one particular summer, and one particular summer does not care in the slightest what the other 19 were like. She had not been cleverer than her neighbors. She could not read a rain gauge any better than Dorsey Kell, and she had no notion in April that 1911 was going to be what it was. What she had was a husband who went through 29 feet of running sand in 1879 because he was not willing to stop at the easy water, and a promise she had made to herself standing in a churchyard in 1892 that she would keep what he had made, and $44 a year, paid 19 times, in good years and in bad, to a hole in the ground that gave her nothing back but water she already had plenty of. That is the whole of it. There was nothing hidden down that well, and nothing lucky about it. It was 42 feet of somebody's labor and 19 springs of somebody's stubbornness, and it made $2,417 in one summer, because for 80 days it was the only water in Ledbetter County. And it was the only water in Ledbetter County because nobody else had been willing to be laughed at for that long. She lived to be 88. She is buried beside her husband in the churchyard at Sable Corner, and the stone gives her name and the 2 dates and nothing else, because she left instructions about that. The house is gone, and the barn is gone, and the 80 acres have been in corn under 3 different owners since the war. But the well house is still standing in a fence corner in a bean field. Low field stone with the roof half fallen in, and if you lift what is left of the lid and drop a pebble, you will hear it hit water. And the breath that comes up out of that hole on an August afternoon is still cold enough to make you take a step back. There is no marker on it. There never was. Sometimes the thing that saved a whole county is a low stone building in a fence corner that nobody stops for, and 40 oak barrels that got a laugh on a Saturday morning, and an old woman who paid $24 every April of her life for water she did not need yet.